3 days of riding. And the first thing he saw coming down to the yard, a loaded rifle, leveled at his chest. 3 women, standing in a line. Nobody spoke. In his saddlebag was a folded paper, a piece of land, a whole life wrapped in oilcloth. He'd ridden 3 days to reach the place that was supposed to be his alone. So whose rifle was that? Behind them, the house stood square in the afternoon light. Someone had loved this place, tended it one board at a time. That someone wasn't here anymore. And nobody would say where he'd gone. The afternoon went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something. The woman in the center held out a paper. "Read it," she said, and slow, very slow. His hand slid toward the rifle at his hip. 3 days, that was all it took to leave one life behind and ride into another. 3 days in the saddle through country that got lonelier with every mile. Canyon passes where the rock walls pressed in so close they blocked the sun for hours. Dry creek beds that had since water since April. The bones of homesteads that didn't survive. Doors hanging open. Window glass long shattered. Wind moving through empty rooms like it had bought the place at auction and taken possession. 3 days with nothing but his horse and his thoughts. His thoughts were worse company than the silence. Gideon Ash was 35 years old enough to carry things a man couldn't put down. Young enough that some stubborn part of him, the part that hadn't been fully extinguished by 4 years of war and 3 years of grief, still believed in the idea of starting over. Still believed a man could outrun his past if he rode far enough in the right direction. He'd been testing that theory for 5 years. The land deed sat in his saddlebag, folded careful, wrapped in oilcloth against the dust and the sweat of 3 days hard riding. $2,200. Every cent he'd accumulated across 5 years of working other men's land from Wyoming, down through Colorado. 5 years of bunk houses that smelled like wet wool and regret. 5 years of keeping his head down and his mouth shut and his money in a tin can, wedged under his bunk, where nobody thought to look twice. 5 years building toward this, toward land that belonged to him, toward a life where he answered to nobody, toward the one thing he wanted above everything else, and had never once said out loud because saying it out loud felt like admitting to something. Kie. That was what he wanted. Not adventure. Not wealth. Not to be anyone's savior or story. Just quiet. The particular quiet of a man who has put down his rifle and found somewhere to put his hands to work that doesn't end in someone else's death. The war had stolen that from him. 4 years of marching where they pointed. Fighting men whose faces blurred eventually, but whose voices, the kind that came in the dark, the screaming kind, never quite faded. He'd walked out of Virginia in 1865 with a sound in his skull like distant artillery on a still day. Not loud, just present. The way a clock ticks in a room until you can't hear anything else and forget there was ever a time before the ticking. He'd thought ranching would fix it. The rhythm of physical work, the uncomplicated honesty of cattle, the land that didn't care about your history, it helped. For a while. Then Clara died, winter of 1881, fever that took her in 9 days. He'd sat beside her bed believing she'd get through it because she'd been right about everything else, and he'd learned to trust her judgment completely. She wasn't right about that. And when it was done, he'd found himself standing in the doorway of an empty house in Colorado with no particular reason to be in that house anymore. So he started moving. Because moving was better than standing still with it. He locked the memory away. There was a room inside Gideon Ash where certain things lived. He'd gotten very good at keeping that door shut, not now. The valley opened up before him, and he forgot for one full suspended moment every single thing that had been following him. Green. More green than the surveyor's map had suggested. More than he'd dared hope for in country this dry and unforgiving. Mountains rising on 3 sides like walls, constructed by something far older and larger than men. A creek threading silver through the western edge, catching the afternoon light so it looked almost luminous, almost alive. grazing land rolling easy and open toward stands of pine and aspen. And at the center of all of it, a farmhouse, 2 stories, paint weathered to a comfortable working gray but solid, a barn standing square and true against the afternoon sky, corrals with good fence posts, fields that showed real cultivation, real intention. It was real. He'd spent the better part of the second day convincing himself that Silas Rook had sold him a dream, that he'd top this ridge and find scrub and rock and disappointment. But it was real, Gideon Ash, who had stopped allowing himself most things, allowed himself one full breath of something that might have been hope. Then he looked down at the yard and saw her. She was standing in the center of the property, not on the porch, not near the barn, in the middle of the yard, like she'd positioned herself there with deliberate intent. Like she'd heard his horse on the ridge and walked out to the exact geographic center of that land, and planted herself and decided to wait. She was tall. That was the first thing. The only thing. For a moment, she was nearly as tall as he was, and Gideon ran to 6 feet himself. Broad through the shoulders, not with excess, but with work. The kind of shoulders built across years of actual physical labor that had constructed something real and lasting in the muscle and bone. Dark hair pulled back severe from a face that was all strong lines and sharp angles. Cheekbones that could cut glass. Eyes so dark brown they looked black from this distance, and those eyes were tracking him with the focused attention of someone who hadn't decided what he was yet. Not threatening. Not welcoming, just watching. She wasn't Apache the way magazine illustrations tried to make Native women look, all softness and tragedy arranged for an Anglo audience. She was Apache the way the land around her was Apache, old, certain. Completely indifferent to whether you approved of it or not, Gideon Das realized he'd stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of that assessment. Thick stands. He started again. On the porch behind her, because she was not on the porch. She was in the yard. She had placed herself specifically in the yard. 2 other women stood, one with brown hair and the measured stillness of someone who calculated before she moved, one with red blonde hair and a jaw set so hard it looked like she was grinding something between her back teeth. 3 women. Watching him ride down, nobody waved. Nobody called a greeting. The afternoon went very quiet. The particular quiet that has weight behind it. Gideon's hand drifted toward the rifle scabbard. Not reaching, just noting, just making sure it was still there, the way it had always been there since 1862, when he'd learned not to assume. He rode down the ridge. 20 feet out, he reined up. The tall woman, the Apache woman, hadn't moved, hadn't stepped back, hadn't adjusted her expression by so much as a fraction. She stood exactly where she'd been standing when he first saw her, and she watched him come the whole way down with those dark eyes that were reading something written on him that he hadn't put there himself. "You'll be Gideon Ash," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd anticipated. Level. The voice of someone who had learned to say what she meant and had stopped spending effort on what she didn't. "I am." He kept his own voice easy, neutral. The voice of a man who had learned in 4 years of war that the first moments of any uncertain encounter were diagnostic. "And you are?" A pause. Long enough to be intentional, Kestrel. 1 word. No last name attached. No explanation offered. He got the distinct sense that no last name was owed to him. Just Kestrel? "That's what I said. Right?" The brown-haired woman stepped off the porch, moved to stand a pace left of Kestrel, with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had thought about where she should be, and had placed herself there. "Nora Finch," she said. Her voice was softer than Kestrel's, but steadier somehow. The voice of a woman who had made peace with hard things and learned to deliver them without drama. "We've been expecting you, Mr. Ash, expecting me," he said. "Why would you be expecting me?" The red-blonde woman came off the porch without Nora's ceremony. More like she'd been held in place by effort and had finally stopped making that effort. "Because Silas Rook told us you're coming," she said.
Her name was Willie Clay.
Though he didn't know that yet. before he left. He was specific about it. Something cold moved through Gideon's stomach, he told you. He told us considerable things, Willa said. Her jaw tightened. Most were lies. That particular one turned out to be true. Kestrel had not moved, had not taken her eyes off him. She reached into the pocket of her work shirt and produced a folded paper, extended it toward him, not with apology, not with threat, with the plain expectation of a woman who had fact were better faced than avoided. Read it, she said. Gideon dismounted, slow and deliberate. A man who moved slow and deliberate around uncertain situations had tended, in his experience, to live longer than one who moved fast and assumed. He took the paper from her hand. Their fingers came close. Didn't touch. She made sure of that. He unfolded it. And the valley that had looked so green and so real and so full of possibility 5 minutes ago started to feel considerably smaller. The document looked official. Heavy paper. Multiple signatures, wax seals that appeared legitimate, legal language that coiled around itself like something alive and hard to follow. But one clause stood out like a brand burned into cattle. Any transfer of property ownership shall include transfer of all partnership commitments herein described, including but not limited to shared residence, shared labor, shared profits, and shared companionship between all parties involved in said partnership. Shared companionship. He read it again. Then a third time. The way a man reads something, he's hoping will change on the third pass. It didn't change. This can't be enforceable, he said. But even as he said it, he heard how thin it sounded out here. 3 days from a courthouse. 2 days from any lawman who might care. In a valley the rest of the world clearly hadn't bothered to find. You're not in Denver, Willa said, as if she'd read exactly where his mind had gone, which he was beginning to think she might actually be capable of. I can see that. Then you understand. What's in front of you matters. What's in a courthouse 2 days away doesn't. Kestrel had crossed her arms. Not defensively. The way a person crosses their arms when they're done with something but can't leave yet. Silas signed his obligations over, she said. Whatever he promised. Whatever he owed. It transferred with the property. That's what that paper says. Paper Silas wrote, Gideon said. Paper a lawyer in Blackwater. Notarized, Nora corrected. Gently, precisely. The way she said everything. He was beginning to understand. Like she'd learned to carry difficult information in a tone that made it marginally less terrible to receive. We verified it. It's legitimate. He looked at the paper again. Shared residence, shared labor, shared profits, shared... No. He folded it, handed it back. I bought land, he said. A deed. I didn't agree to any of this. No, Kestrel said, taking the paper back. You didn't. That was the part Silas found amusing. The way she said it, flat without inflection as if reporting the temperature, told him everything about what she thought of Silas Rook, and everything about how long she'd been making her peace with it. There's something else, Nora said. Of course there was. There was always something else. How much else? He asked. Nora and Kestrel looked at each other. A look that had a whole conversation compressed inside it. The kind of look that only developed between people who had been through enough together that words had started to become redundant. Kestrel told him straight. $6,500, she said. Bowed to a man named Virgil Crane, merchant in Blackwater. Silas borrowed against this property, equipment, livestock, building materials, signed our names to the loan as co-obligors, took the proceeds from the last cattle sale when he left us the debt. The number landed somewhere in Gideon's chest. $6,500. He had $43 in his pocket. He'd counted that morning out of old habit, the way soldiers counted ammunition. Virgil Crane, he said slowly. When does he get paid? 4 weeks, Willa said. And if he doesn't, he takes the property, Nora said. And per the loan documents, he can claim us as indentured labor to satisfy the remaining debt. 5 years of unpaid work, Gideon stared at her. That's not legal. A lot of things aren't legal, Willa said. the voice of a door closing, doesn't change what happens out here. The valley that had looked like freedom 20 minutes ago now felt like the inside of a very well-designed trap. Mountains on 3 sides, one exit, something waiting at the exit he hadn't known to look for. He looked at Kestrel. She was already looking at him. Had been the whole time. You could leave, she said. Not cruelly, not as an invitation, as a fact delivered by a woman who dealt in facts. You have $43. Enough to get somewhere else and start again. He hadn't told her how much he had. She hadn't guessed. She'd read it. In the 2 minutes since he'd dismounted, she'd looked at the way he sat, the condition of his horse, the wear on his gear, and she'd calculated, and she'd arrived at a number that was almost exactly right. He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll stay tonight," he said. "Figure it out in the morning." Kestrel nodded once, like that was acceptable. Like she'd expected nothing more and prepared for nothing less. "Barns around back," she said. "Third stall. Grain bins on the left." She walked toward the house. She walked the way a woman walked, who had never in her life waited for a door to be opened for her, and had stopped registering the sense of that expectation so long ago that the expectation itself had become foreign. Gideon watched her go and thought, "This is either the worst thing that has ever happened to me," or he didn't finish the thought. Locked it away with the other things he couldn't afford. The barn was better than the farmhouse had suggested. He noticed it the moment he stepped inside. Clean. Organized in a way that spoke not of recent effort, but of habitual care. The kind that had become automatic over time. Tack hung on proper pegs. Tools stored neat and placed where they'd be found in darkness. Hay stacked with real attention to how it would settle and keep. The 2 horses in the first stalls were healthy, eyes bright, coats smooth, hooves recently trimmed, animals in the care of someone who understood them. He put his horse in the third stall, as instructed, unsaddled him slow, gave him water. Grain from the bin on the left, exactly where Kestrel had said it would be. He let himself look at the barn while he worked. The repairs done here, recently. New boards on the third stall, lighter colored than the rest, not yet weathered to match. The additions built there, practical and without waste. Someone had thought about this space, had planned it, had worked it into what it was over considerable time. This was not a barn Silas Rook had built. This was a barn someone had cared for. He stood thinking about that longer than he needed to. The house was nicer than the outside had prepared him for. Plank floors swept smooth from years of use, not from recent effort. Walls freshly whitewashed. A braided rug in the main room that still held color. Real curtains at the windows, not feed sacks tacked up. Actual curtains that someone had hemmed. A fireplace with a proper mantel. Furniture simple but solidly built. The kind of furniture that had been made to last by someone who intended to stay. A home. Not just walls and a roof. A home. Nora came from the kitchen, carrying a tray. Bread, hard cheese. A bowl of something that had been cooking all day and knew it. "Thought you'd be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the table the way you set something down for someone you'd been expecting. Like feeding a stranger who had just inherited a share of their lives, was simply what you did next. "Thank you," he said, because he had nothing better. "Your room's upstairs. First door on the right." She paused at the kitchen doorway, turned back. "We're not your enemies, Mr. Ash. I know that's not how it looks from where you're standing." She left before he could figure out whether he believed her. He ate without tasting, thought in circles that didn't arrive anywhere. Then he went upstairs and found the room exactly as she'd described. Small, clean, a bed properly made, a wash basin with water already in it, a lamp burning low on the bedside table. Someone had lit it before he came up. Anticipated his arrival in the dark, he set his rifle against the wall within reach. Old habit from 1862 that he'd never managed to unlearn. Outside the window, the last light left the sky. He pulled out the deed. Bought property. Transferred from Silas Rook to Gideon Ash. $2,200. Paid in full. All rights and privileges thereof granted to, said Gideon Ash, all rights and privileges, including, apparently, $6,500 of debt he hadn't borrowed, 3 women he hadn't agreed to, and a 4-week countdown toward a man named Virgil Crane, who sounded like exactly the kind of man Gideon had spent 5 years learning to avoid. The sensible thing, the obvious thing, was to leave. Tonight, while they slept. Take his horse and ride north toward Colorado and find work and start over with $43. And whatever remained of his dignity after this, he'd started over before, after Virginia, after his parents. After Clara, he could start over again, except he lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the barn, about how clean it was, about the new boards on the 3rd stall that hadn't weathered yet, about the tack-on labeled pegs, about the grain bin on the left, exactly where she'd said. He thought about Kestrel saying we checked. Plural, calm, like the 3 of them had sat down and read the document together and made a plan and kept going because that was what you did when the alternative was giving up. He thought about the thing nobody had said out loud, that they'd told him he could leave. But nobody had said where Silas Rook had gone. The knock came when the lamp had burned low. 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate, come in, Kestrel. She'd changed from the work shirt to something simpler. Dark cotton plain, that somehow made her look larger rather than smaller, which was a thing he hadn't thought possible. Hair still pulled back but looser. A few strands coming free around her face. She was carrying 2 cups, coffee. He could smell it from across the room. She set one on the bedside table without asking, sat in the chair by the window without asking. Like she'd decided to do a thing, and had done it, and if he objected, he was welcomed to say so. He didn't say so. She wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked out the dark window at nothing in particular. I know what you're thinking, she said. You've known everything I'm thinking since I rode down that ridge. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. Not quite. The ridge is too far. I couldn't read you from there. When could you? 20 feet out. She took a slow sip. You'd already decided to stay. I hadn't. You just hadn't told yourself. She looked at him then. Dark eyes direct and without apology. Man who's going to leave doesn't come down a ridge slow and easy. He stays up where he can think. Man who comes down, he's already chosen. He just hasn't admitted it yet. Gideon looked at his coffee cup. She wasn't wrong. That was the part that was difficult. Tell me about Silas Rook, he said. A pause. Brief but considered. What part? Start with what's not in the contract. She turned the cup in her hands. Slow. Not nervousness. Deliberation. Deciding not what to tell him, but how much. I'm in Blackwater, she said finally. 2 years ago. I was doing laundry work for a hotel there. He came through buying supplies. He was good-looking. Easy manner. Said all the right things. A pause that carried weight. Men who say all the right things, you have to notice that. The right thing said too smoothly, that's practice. That's someone who's said it before. You knew, I suspected. There's a difference. Her voice stayed level throughout. Suspecting doesn't help you when you have nowhere else to go and someone is offering you land and a home and the chance to put down roots in some place, she said it, without reaching for sympathy. That was the thing about Kestrel that he was starting to understand. She didn't reach for pity, and she didn't offer it. She said what was true, and she let it be what it was. He brought us all here, she continued. Nora, Willa, me, different promises for each of us, different stories. Same valley. She looked out the window again. He was smart enough to let us do the work. The irrigation channels, I designed those. 4 months of planning, 2 months digging. The cattle, Willa sourced every animal, negotiated every price. The accounts, the planting schedule, the crop rotation, that was Nora. He signed his name to things. Made himself look like a man building something. While actually building an exit, we figured that out about 6 months ago. Found papers in the loft. Loan documents, correspondence with Virgil Crane. She set down her cup. He'd been planning it since the 2nd month. Borrowed. against at the prop for things we'd already paid for ourselves. Waited until the cattle and the crops were worth enough that his cut of the last sale paid for whatever he was going to next. And then he took it, and then he took it. She said it quiet, final, not broken. The way a door closes on something that has been closed for a while already. The physical act of closing just confirming what was already true. Gideon thought about the barn again. About who had replaced those boards. About irrigation channels designed by someone who understood water. This isn't Silas Rook's farm, he said. She looked at him. No, she said, it isn't, it's yours. The word sat between them for a moment. She held it. Ours, she said, meaning the three of them. Not him, not yet. He understood that. How much can we save? He asked. She didn't answer immediately, which told him the math wasn't good, which told him she'd already done it. Cattle are worth $3,000 at fair market. Virgil won't pay fair market. He has first rights to everything we produce. He'll set his own price. The wheat won't be ready for 7 weeks. We need the money in 4. Gold. He'd seen the canyon from the ridge. The rock formation along the northern wall. 2 years in Colorado mining country had taught him what certain formations meant, and he'd been thinking about it since he came down. She looked at him with those dark eyes. You saw it, she said, not a question. The north wall. The formation. Silas worked the creek there for 3 weeks. Gave up. Said there wasn't enough. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. He said a lot of things. What do you think? She was quiet for a moment. I think Silas had a low opinion of effort. He almost smiled. 4 weeks, he said. Everything we can get from the cattle. The wheat, if we can move any early, and whatever that canyon has. Is there a number that gets us to 6,500? She studied him. The way she studied everything, looking for the thing beneath the surface. Possibly, she said. With 4 people working it correctly. 4. You, me, Nora, Willa. She said it like it was already arranged. Like his agreement was a formalist prepared to wait for, but had already built her planning around. I need to think about it. She stood, picked up her empty cup. Think fast, she said. We lose a day. We lose a day. At the door she stopped, didn't look back. The coffee was real, she said. We're not desperate, we're watering it down yet, and she was gone. Gideon sat in the small, clean room, with the lamp burning down, and thought about a woman who brought coffee to a stranger and sat in his chair and said things that cost something to say, and then walked out without making any of it into a performance. He thought about Clara, about the way she used to sit across the supper table and just talk, not toward a destination, just talking, like the conversation itself was enough reason. He hadn't talked with anyone like that in 3 years. He put that thought away where he put things, and went to sleep. Morning arrived the way it does when you've spent half the night waiting for it. Roosters first, then chickens. Then a screen door somewhere below. Gideon dressed in the dark out of habit. The habit of 5 years of bunkhouses and 4 years before that of not wanting to be caught still in a bedroll. Checked his rifle before he touched anything else, and went downstairs. The kitchen was already working. Kestrel was at the stove. Not tending it, working it, the way you worked something you'd done enough times that the motion had gone below thought. Her back was to him. He registered again the width of her shoulders, the unhurried economy of her movements. She moved in that kitchen the way she'd moved in the yard. Like she occupied the space, not because she was claiming it, but because she simply did. Wiltha sat at the table, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on wet stone, filling the quiet room. She looked up when he came in, looked back down, said nothing. Nora appeared from outside, carrying eggs, her breath making small clouds in the cool morning air. She stopped when she saw him, smiled. Small and careful, the smile of someone who had learned to ration warmth, because not everyone turned out to deserve it. You stayed, she said. I stayed. Good. She moved toward the stove. Sit down, eggs are almost ready. He sat across from Willa, who kept working the knife with the concentrated attention of a person who was not, in any meaningful sense, sharpening a knife. "How's the edge?" he asked. She looked up, green eyes with the directness of someone who had decided social niceties were expensive and wasn't buying. "Sharp enough," she said. "For what?" "Whatever needs doing." He decided he respected that. Kestrel set a plate in front of him. Eggs, bacon, bread still warm from the oven. She sat with her own plate and ate without ceremony or conversation, without any apparent expectation that he owed her words or explanation, or gratitude for this moment. He ate. The food was extraordinary, the kind of cooking that came from years of practice and genuine attention to detail, from someone who had decided that even simple things were worth doing right. "What did Silas tell you about me?" he asked. Kestrel didn't look up from her plate. "That you were Union Army, that you'd been moving since the war, that you wanted to be left alone. He told you a lot for a man planning to disappear." He was careful. She set her fork down, looked at him. "He wanted us to trust you when you arrived. Or at least, not shoot you before you reached the porch." Willa looked up. "Still working on that second part," she said. "The not shooting part?" he asked. "The trusting part." He looked at her. She held the look without blinking, without softening it, without adding anything that would make it easier. "Fair enough," he said, and meant it. She could tell he meant it. Something in her jaw eased a fraction, just enough to notice. After breakfast, he said what he'd been deciding since before dawn. "Show me everything. The fields, the cattle, the water system. Whatever you've built, whatever's broken. I want to understand what I actually bought." The three women looked at each other in that way they had. That rapid, nearly invisible communication that happened between people who had been through enough together that some conversations had moved below the level of language. Then Kestrel stood. Got her hat from the peg by the door. "Come on then," she said. The irrigation system stopped him. He'd seen irrigation before. He'd worked farms in Colorado that had it. He knew what it looked like when someone had dug channels to move water from a source to a field. He had not seen anything that looked like this. The main channel ran from the creek along a grade, so precisely calculated it must have been surveyed. But no professional surveyor had been within 50 miles of this valley in years, which meant someone had done it themselves, by observation and calculation, and the kind of patient attention to how water actually moved that most people never developed. Off the main channel, 3 branches fed 3 separate fields through a network of fitted stone that barely needed mortar. Built to last, built for the long term. Built by someone who intended to be here in 20 years and wanted the water still working when they were. He crouched beside the main channel, ran his hand along the stonework. "Who designed this?" "I did." She was standing behind him, arms crossed, watching him look at her work with an expression he could see from where he was. He stood. "Your father?" Something moved briefly in her face. "My father knew water," she said. He could read a hillside and tell you where the water moved underneath, where it would surface in drought, where it would flood in spring. She looked at the channel. "He taught me to read it the same way. Where is he now?" A pause. "Just long enough. Gone," she said. He didn't ask how. He knew how. He knew how things went for Apache people in this territory in these years. He knew it in the practical, witnessed way of a man who'd ridden through this country for 5 years and paid attention. He didn't need her to explain it, and he understood. In the way he understood certain things about himself that he didn't discuss, that she didn't want to. "This is months of work," he said instead. 6, she said. 4 to plan it right. 2 to dig. Silas helped. The corner of her mouth did the thing again. The shape that came before a smile without becoming one. "Silas supervised," she said. "He was very good at that." Willa, walking ahead of them, made a sound. Nora looked at the sky and said nothing, which was agreement. The cattle were 35 head of mixed stock. All healthy. All showing the care of someone who understood animals. Pasture rotated right, water access managed. The kind of attention that took time and knowledge. and the willingness to put the herd's needs ahead of everything else when necessary. "We bought them ourselves," Willa said. She moved among them with the ease of someone the animals had already decided about, pulled what we'd saved from other work. Silas said he'd match it. "Buy another 30 head, plus make us a real operation." He didn't. Spent it in Blackwater. Her jaw tightened. "Whiskey and cards, best I could ever figure." Gideon counted them. Estimated weight, condition. Market price at fair value. 3,000 to 3,200. Maybe more with the right buyer. Except Virgil Crane had first rights, and Virgil Crane would set his own price. The wheat fields were 2 acres, close planted, heads just starting to show. Good growth, better than good. The soil had been worked and improved over 2 seasons, and whatever Nora had done with the planting schedule was showing in the density. 7 weeks to harvest, Nora said, walking the edge of her field the way she looked at everything. Steady assessing, always 3 steps ahead, maybe 8. This soil, this stand, 1,000 pounds to the acre. Maybe 1,200 if things go right. But Virgil has first rights to the wheat, too. To everything we produce, she said. At prices he sets, she looked at him. He'll offer half what it's worth. Less, probably. He'll know we can't refuse. Gideon stood at the edge of that wheat field and did the arithmetic he'd been running since last night and kept arriving at the same place, even. At fair prices, 3,000 on the cattle. 1,200 on the wheat, they were over 2,000 short. At Virgil's prices, the actual gap was closer to 4,500. And somewhere in the northern wall of this valley there was a canyon with a creek and gold that a lazy man had given up on. "Show me the canyon," he said. Kestrel was already moving. The canyon ran cold and clear along the bottom, mountain runoff. The kind of cold that took the feeling from your hands in under a minute. The walls were a formation he could recognize from 2 years ago in Colorado. The kind that told a man paying attention that something had been happening here for a very long time, and some of it was valuable. He crouched at the creek's edge, scooped gravel and sand, swirled it in his palm. The light material washed away. And there, in what remained, the particular heavy yellow gleam that only one thing produced. Gold. Not much, just flakes. But real. He looked up at Kestrel. She was watching him with an expression that looked like nothing on the surface and contained everything underneath. Silas worked the surface gravel, Gideon said. He didn't look at the formation. He pointed to where the canyon bent, where the current had slowed over decades and deposited its heaviest cargo against the outer wall. That bend. Outside wall. That's where it concentrates. Not the middle, the outside, where the current drops weight. She looked where he pointed. Looked back. Look back. How much? Practical question. Only question that mattered. I don't know yet. Enough to change the numbers, maybe. But 4 people working it hard every day we can work. And we still have a farm to run, she nodded. She'd already thought through this. She'd already arrived here. She was waiting for him to catch up. 2 at the canyon, she said. 2 at the farm. Rotate every other day. That water's cold enough to. I know what that water is, she said. I've been in that canyon in July. I know what it costs. He looked at her. At the flat certainty. At the set of her shoulders, broad and level. The shoulders of a woman who had decided what she was willing to pay and had stopped reconsidering it. Last night you said possibly, he said. She tilted her head slightly when I asked if there was a number that got us to 6,500. You said possibly, a pause. One of her considered ones. Still possibly, she said. Less impossible than yesterday. Not confidence. Not hope. Something more solid than either. The refusal to accept a defeat before it actually arrived. He looked at the creek. At the canyon wall. At math that was still brutal but was no longer entirely without solution. He looked at her. She was already looking at him. Had been, he realized. The whole time. All right, he said. We start at dawn. She nodded once. Already moving. Already thinking about what came between now and dawn and what needed to be done in that time. He watched her walk toward the canyon mouth and thought, she built this, not Silas Rook. Not a man who'd come in and put his name on things. Her the channels, the cattle, the fields, the barn with a tack-on labeled pegs, the home inside that house that could have been just four walls, her hands, her knowledge, her refusal to stop. And some man had walked in and signed his name and walked away with the money. Something moved in Gideon Ash's chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Since the war, maybe. Since the last time he'd watched something innocent get crushed by something greedy and had been close enough to do something about it. He'd thought he was done with that feeling. Turned out, he'd just been resting. He caught up with her at the canyon mouth. Kestrel. She stopped. Turned. Whatever Silas took, he said. Whatever Virgil Crane thinks he's going to take. They don't get to win, he held her gaze. I can't guarantee that, but it's the promise I'm making. She looked at him. A long moment. Measuring, I know, she said. He hadn't expected that, you know. You didn't leave last night, she said. Man who's going to leave leaves. Man who stays. She paused. Man who stays means something by it. She turned and walked out of the canyon. And Gideon Ash stood in a cold creek bed, with gold in the gravel, and 4 weeks on the clock, and felt the locked room inside him crack open. Just a little. Just enough for something to move through that wasn't grief. He looked up at the canyon walls. 4 weeks, he said to no one. Then he went to figure out how to make it enough. The first morning in the canyon, the water was so cold. It felt like the creek had a personal grievance. Gideon stepped in up to his knees and felt the breath leave him in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Snowmelt from peaks that stayed white all year, coming down through rock and shadow, arriving here still carrying the memory of ice. His hands went numb in 40 seconds. He kept working. Kestrel was already ahead of him in the water, already moving gravel with the long-handled shovel they'd brought down on the pack mule, filling buckets with the methodical efficiency of a person who had decided on a task and was going to finish it without drama. She didn't flinch at the cold, didn't comment on it, just worked, breath making small clouds in the morning air. Movements, steady and unhurried and absolutely relentless. He watched her for a moment, then started shoveling the arrangement. Kestrel and Gideon on the first day. Nora and Willa holding the farm. Rotate every other day. Keep everything moving until they ran out of time or ran out of option. Whichever came first. The math hadn't improved overnight, still brutal. Still at the edge of impossible. But borderline was something to work with. He positioned them at the outside of the canyon's bend, where the current slowed and dropped its heaviest cargo before moving on. Within the first hour, they found more color than Silas had probably seen in 3 weeks of casual effort. Not much. But real, consistent. They worked through the morning in silence that wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised him. Gideon was a man who'd spent 5 years engineering his own solitude, and working in a cold creek with a woman he'd known for less than a day should have felt like a particular form of torture. But Kestrel's silence was different from most people's silence. Most people's silence was noise that hadn't decided what to be yet. Hers was actual silence, complete, chosen. The silence of someone who had made peace with quiet and had been living in it long enough that it had become a kind of home. He found himself matching her rhythm without deciding to. Shovel. Fill the bucket. Pan. Collect. Dump. Begin again. The sun climbed, the water stayed cold. His hands went from numb to aching to something, past aching that he stopped trying to name. At midday, they stopped to eat on the bank. Bread and cold beans and dried meat from what Nora had packed, sitting with their feet out of the water and the blood coming back into their toes in a way that was almost worse than the cold. Kestrel ate without looking at him, looked at the quagnon, instead reading it the way she should, looked at everything, looking for information, looking for what the thing was actually saying, underneath what it appeared to be. The formation changes, she said, pointing upstream, where the wall went darker, more fractured. About 40 yards, he'd seen it on the way in, hadn't said anything. Wanted to see if she'd see it. She'd seen it. Different age of rock, he said. Older. She ate another bite. The older rock is where the gold concentrated. When the water ran differently millions of years ago, he looked at her. Your father taught you that too? Something moved briefly in her face. Complicated and fast. My father taught me to read what was in front of me, she said. The rest I worked out. He thought about what that meant. A young Apache woman, alone, watching the land and asking questions and arriving at answers from first principles, because there was no one to ask and no institution that would teach her what she needed to know. We should move up there this afternoon, he said. She was already standing the afternoon better, not good, better. Which was what they had. The older formation gave up its gold more readily. Not generously, not the way men fantasized about gold, but steadily, flake by flake. Each one small and silent and heavy in the specific way that only gold was heavy, that density that made even a little feel like more than it was. By the time the sun started dropping, they had maybe $40, 40 out of 6,500. He didn't say it out loud. No point. They both knew the arithmetic. But he caught Kestrel looking at what they'd collected, with an expression that, for the first time since he'd arrived, showed something that wasn't certainty. In another face, it might have been despair. In hers, it looked like a person revising a calculation that had come out differently than hoped. Tomorrow will be better, he said. She looked at him. Level. You don't know that. No, he said. But I'm going to believe it until I have proof otherwise. A pause. She looked back at the creek. That's a very Anglo way to handle a problem, she said. He almost laughed. Is there a better one? She picked up the collection vial, held it to the fading light. $40 of gold dust caught the sun and glittered very beautiful. Nowhere near enough. Apache way, she said. You look at what is, not what you hope. What is? She lowered the vial. What is right now is that $40 a day doesn't save us. What saves us? She was quiet. I don't know yet, she said. I'm still looking at what is. They rode back to the farm in the long shadow of late afternoon. A different kind of quiet between them now. Heavier. More loaded with the things neither of them said because they both already knew them. Nora had been ready. Real stew, thick and dark. The kind that had been thinking about itself all day. Bread still warm. Coffee that tasted like someone had decided the situation warranted the good stuff. 4 people around the table. Gideon set the vial in the center without comment. Nora picked it up, held it to the lamp. $40. Give or take, she set it down. That's one day. Yes. Willa was looking at her stew with the attention she usually gave her knife. Working through something. If it's 40 every day, she said. For 28 days, 1,120, Nora said. Already done. Of course, plus cattle at whatever Virgil offers. Plus wheat if we can move any early. Best case, she paused. Best case, Gideon said. Best case is 4,000. Maybe 4,200 if everything goes right. She looked at him. We need 6,500. 2,300 short. At a minimum. The stew cooled in the bowls while nobody looked directly at anyone else. Then Willa said, There's more. Everyone looked at her. The formation at the north end of the canyon, she said, still looking at her bowl. The darker rock. She put down her spoon, picked it up, set it down again. The main vein doesn't run along the creek. It runs into the hillside. She looked up, at Kestrel, not at Gideon, where the rock face cracked, about 60 feet back from the water. You know the place? Kestrel went very still. How do you know about that? She said. I went up there 3 weeks ago, after Silas left. I was just looking, trying to understand what we actually had. She looked at the table. There's a seam in the rock face. Not gravel gold, hard rock gold. A pause. I didn't say anything because I don't know how to get at it. It needs tools I don't know how to use. A different kind of quiet settled over the table. Hard rock gold. Seam gold. The kind that required breaking stone rather than washing gravel. The kind that, if the seam went deep enough, could change every number they'd been looking at. Show me tomorrow, Gideon said. Willa looked at him. something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not trust exactly, but the shape that came before trust started to form. After breakfast, she said. The seam was real, he knew it the moment. His hand touched the rock face. Felt the texture shift. Quartz matrix, different from the surrounding stone. Picked up a fragment from the base of the crack and held it to the morning light, gold threaded through the quartz like veins through a man's hand. Not a fortune. Not the motherlode men dreamed about in saloons, but a seam, a genuine seam. And if it ran back into the hillside at the angle it appeared to be going, then the numbers changed. We need a real pick, he said. Mining pick, not prospecting tools, chisels, and someone who can take over when my arms give. Willa raised her hand. She was not large, but she was built compact and dense the way some people were built, and the muscles in her forearms, when she crossed them, were not decorative. You sure? He said. I've been sure about things my whole life, I said. Most of them were right. He believed her immediately. So they reorganized. Kestrel and Nora on the farm. Nora because she understood the irrigation and the crops. Kestrel because her instinct for the cattle was something that couldn't be transferred. Gideon and Willa at the canyon. The hard rock work, the pick and chisel work that was a different quality of brutal from panning, wood every other day. Trade expertise. Cover ground. The daily take improved. Not dramatically, but measurably, every day. The seam was giving. Slowly, grudgingly, the way everything worth having in this valley gave, but giving. And something else was happening. In the margins of the work, in the evenings, in the silences between the necessary things. They were becoming something. Not friends, not family, not yet. Something earlier than both. That thing that formed between people suffering circumstances at the same sick time who had chosen not to blame each other for it. Gideon noticed it first in how dinner had changed. The first night had been 4 people eating in careful proximity, measuring every word. Now it was 4 people eating, sometimes talking, sometimes not, and the silence was as comfortable as the conversation. Willa had developed the habit of saying exactly one devastating thing per meal, and then going quiet for the rest of it. And somehow her one thing was always exactly right. Nora had started reading from the almanac while they ate, weather predictions, market prices, planting guidance. And no one had asked her to, and no one had asked her to stop, and Gideon had found it oddly settling. Like evidence that the world still had a comprehensible order. And Kestrel, who he was starting to understand the way you understood a landscape after you'd been looking at it long enough. Not fully, but enough to navigate. She was up before everyone else, every morning. The stove lit and coffee ready before he came downstairs. And she was either in the barn or at the kitchen window, looking at something in the middle distance he couldn't locate. He never asked what she was looking at. He understood it wasn't something he could see from where he stood. She didn't make small talk, did not offer comfort, didn't say things would be fine when she didn't know if they would be. What she did was work, continuously, without complaint, without drama, with a calm and an endurance he found increasingly remarkable. Not the height, not the physical strength, though both were real, but the endurance. The flat, unfussy determination to keep going when the numbers were batted and the water was cold and the gold came out by the single flake. He told her this one evening on the porch. Didn't mean to say it out loud. It just came out. She considered it for a moment, like she was deciding how to receive it. Endurance isn't a virtue, she said. It's what's left when you run out of other options. You've had a lot of options taken from you. Everyone has. She looked at the valley going dark. Apache, Anglo, doesn't matter. The world takes things. What's left is what you are. He sat with that. What are you? He asked. A long silence. Her kind? Still here, she said. The simplest answer he'd ever heard, and somehow the most complete. The storm came on the 9th day. No warning. Or not enough. The sky had gone a color that Kestrel mentioned at dinner, but it looked like sunset, and he'd made the mistake of treating it like one. He woke to rain hitting the roof like something with a purpose. Mountain storm. Cold and forceful and completely indifferent to what four people needed it not to do. He was downstairs in minutes. Kestrel was already at the window, watching, her face unreadable. "Canyon's flooded," she said. "You can't see the canyon. From here, I can hear the creek." A pause. "It sounds different." He listened. She was right. A low, continuous sound, just under the rain. A mile away, the creek was audible in a way it hadn't been before. 3 days of work. Minimum. Lost. 3 days they didn't have. Gideon stood beside her at the window. Neither of them said what they were calculating. The storm didn't care about their math. "What do we do?" he asked. She looked at him like the question was slightly unexpected. "We work the farm," she said. There's always work. There was the storm, revealed what the valley had been keeping quiet. A section of west pasture fencing that had been close to failing and was now down. A patch of barn roof where Gideon's second-day repair hadn't taken. The secondary irrigation branch where a stone had shifted enough to let sediment block the flow. They fixed all of it, in the rain. Kestrel and Gideon on the barn roof first, because the cattle needed shelter and the shelter had a hole. He handed materials up. She positioned and drove nails, because she could hold a roofing nail with 2 fingers in driving rain and hit it true every time, and he recognized quickly that it was more efficient to support her than to compete with her. They didn't talk much on the roof. The rain was too loud, but at one point she reached past him for a nail, and her right hand was close enough for him to see the knuckles, cracked, split in 2 places. The damage of cold water and continuous work and never quite enough time for healing. He didn't say anything. She didn't notice him looking, or she noticed and decided it wasn't worth addressing. With Kestrel, sometimes the distinction was invisible. The fencing took all 4 of them. Willa driving posts because she was best with the mallet. Nora, calling the line because her eye for level was something you couldn't train. She could look at a run of fence and tell you in seconds what was true and what wasn't. Kestrel and Gideon, stringing wire. Stringing wire in the rain was miserable, in the intimate way that only wet manual labor was miserable. Cold wire, wet gloves or no gloves, neither option good. The wire wanting to spring back and cut you if you gave it the chance. Posts never quite where you needed them. Mud that made a 50-foot walk into an event. But they finished, and stood in the rain looking at the fixed fence with the particular satisfaction that came from doing something hard correctly. Willa said, "I hate this." Nora said, "I know." Kestrel said nothing. Gideon said, "Good fence, though." Willa looked at the fence. Looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "Good fence." The second day of the storm was when things changed. Not the storm. The storm kept going with the same conviction. What changed was the people. Because when there's no work that requires all your attention, when the animals are fed and the structures are sound, there's nothing left but rain and waiting. People talk. Not about the debt, not about the gold. About the other things. It started with Nora. She was at the table with her accounts. 2 ledgers. One for what was true, one for what needed to be true. Updated daily with the meticulousness of someone who had made precision into a form of control when other forms weren't available. Willa was sharpening something. Gideon was mending tech because his hands needed occupation, or his mind started down roads he'd closed. Kestrel was at the window. "Where did you learn accounts?" he asked Nora, because he'd been wondering, and the rain made the question feel less intrusive. She looked up. "My husband," she said. "He kept books for a dry goods store in Missouri. Taught me because—" A pause. "He said I was better at it than he was." Which was probably true, a small, complicated smile. He died in '63. Chickamauga. The war, always the war. Like a stone thrown into still water 20 years ago, the rings still reaching every shore. "I'm sorry," Gideon said. "Thank you," she meant it. "After that I had to useful or I didn't eat. So I kept books for whoever needed them kept. Moved west because there was more work." She looked at the ledger. Then I met Silas in Dodge City. He had a plan. It seemed like a reasonable plan, she said, the last part without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Willa looked up from her knife. Mine was a horse breeder in Kansas, she said. To no one in particular. To the middle distance. He didn't die. He just decided he didn't want a wife anymore. Decided it fairly loudly in front of several people. She looked back at the knife. So I left before he could finish deciding. Silence. I've never been married, Kestrel said. They all looked at her. She was still at the window. Silas told me he intended to, she continued. He was specific. Said he'd take me to the Justice of the Peace in Blackwater once the farm was established. She turned from the window, looked at the room. I believed him. The quiet after that was its own particular quality. Gideon thought about what it cost her to say that. In a room with 2 Anglo women and an Anglo man. In a territory where her people were being systematically displaced. In a year when the laws and the money and the courts belonged to people who looked nothing like her. To say, I believed him. I let myself believe him. I wanted what he was offering. That wasn't weakness. That was something that required more honesty than most things. He set down the tack he'd been mending. I believed someone too, he said. Everyone looked at him. Not about land, he looked at his hands. At the old calluses and the new ones layering over them. My wife. She got sick in the winter of '81. She believed she'd get through it, and I believed her. Because she'd been right about everything else, and I'd learned to trust her judgment about things. He paused. She wasn't right about that. The rain on the roof, the lamp on the table, Clara, Willa said. Quiet, not a question. She'd heard the name before. He understood without him knowing he'd said it. Clara. He said nobody offered for comfort. Nobody reached for the phrases people reached for when they didn't know what else to do. They just let it be what it was. Kestrel came away from the window, sat down at the table, picked up a piece of tack he'd set aside, and started working on it without asking permission. She didn't say anything, but she sat down, and that was the thing that mattered most. The 3rd day of the storm, he lay in the dark before dawn, thinking about what it meant to start being interested in things again. Not in a woman, specifically. In anything. In the canyon and the gold and the problem of $6,500. In Nora's 2 ledgers and the precision she brought to them. In Willa's 1 devastating observation per dinner. In the way, Kestrel stood at windows in the mornings, looking at something he couldn't locate. Being interested meant there was a future. And a future meant the past was behind you. And the past being behind you felt like a kind of betrayal of the person who would always live in it. He lay in the dark and argued with himself about that for a while. Then he got up. Because that kind of argument only went one direction in the dark, and he knew where that was. He found Kestrel in the barn. She was there whenever she needed to think. He'd worked this out by day 2. The animals asked nothing of her beyond care, which she could give, and in return they didn't require explanation. She was brushing the sorrel mare that had gotten anxious in the storm. Long, even strokes. The horse had settled under her hands the way horses settled under people they'd decided about. Rain's letting up, he said from the doorway. I know. She kept brushing. Another day, maybe. Then we can go back up. Creek will be high. High water moves more gravel. She switched sides. Might be better after. He watched her work for a moment. The documents Silas left, he said. The loan papers, the plans. He signed your names as co-obligors. Yes, which means he built a paper trail connecting you to this property. Even if you'd run when he did, Virgil could have come after you. A long silence. We knew, she said. Nora figured it out 2 days after he left. She turned then, looked at him directly. He didn't just leave us with the debt. He made sure we couldn't get away from it. Deliberate, very deliberate. Her voice stayed level, but her eyes were something else. Not grief and not anger, but the thing that remained after you'd been through both and come out the other side. It looked like carelessness. Like a man who made promises he couldn't keep. But if you look at all of it together, it was architecture, Gideon said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it was. He thought about Silas Rook in a Santa Fe saloon. Easy smile. The right things said with the ease of someone who had said them many times before. The surveyor's map, the legal documents. Everything looking legitimate because the fraud wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the intention beneath it. How many times has he done? Judge asked. We found evidence of at least 4 others, she said. Different territories, different women. Same architecture. She looked at the horse, which was watching her with patient dark eyes. Same farm, different valley, different Virgil Crane. He did this for a living, Gideon said. He did this for a living. Something cold and very purposeful moved through Gideon's chest. Not anger. He'd moved through anger somewhere back in the canyon. Purpose. The clarifying kind. The kind that came from understanding exactly what you were dealing with and deciding it was not going to win. Then we make sure he doesn't get to do it again, he said. We have $6,500 to find first, she said. I know. But after, he pushed off the doorframe. After, we make sure someone knows what he is. She held his gaze for a moment. Then something moved in her face. Not a smile, not yet, but the shape that preceded one. The shape that said a smile might exist somewhere in the future. After, she said, like a commitment. On the 14th day, Virgil Crane arrived, 2 weeks early. Gideon and Willa were working the seam. It had opened slightly after the storm, giving in a single day what it had given across the entire first week. When Kestrel appeared at the canyon mouth on horseback, fast. The way she rode when something required speed. He put down the pick. She pulled up short, her face controlled, her eyes doing something different from controlled. Riders, she said, from Blackwater. 12. He looked at Willa. She looked at him. How far? 20 minutes. Then we ride. Virgil Crane's men were already in the yard when they came through the gate. 12 of them. The kind of men who hired themselves to people like Virgil Crane, which was to say, men who had stopped caring about much a while ago. Horses well kept, rifles visible, money and intent both on display, and at the front, Virgil Crane himself. Gideon had been building a picture of him across 14 days of hearing about him, and the reality was both less and more, less theatrical. Virgil Crane was not the villain of a dime novel. He was a large man, 6 feet and heavy, with decades of good eating, face carrying old scars from something long past, expensive clothes worn without vanity, the look of someone who had been in enough confrontations that they had stopped producing any particular feeling. He dismounted with surprising ease, looked at the 4 of them on the porch. Let the silence work. Because men like Virgil Crane knew what silence was for. They used it the way a carpenter used a level. To find what tilted. Well now, he said, gravel and stone in his voice. Looks like we got ourselves a full house. Gideon stepped down off the porch. 1 step. Deliberate. You're early, he said. Just passing through. Virgil opened his hands. The performance of a reasonable man. Checking on my investment. Your investment is a debt, Gideon said. Not a property. Virgil smiled. Showed teeth. Debt secured by property. Different thing, Mr. Ash. Behind him on the porch, Kestrel had not moved, had not reached for anything. Had simply become still, the specific stillness of a very large, very composed person who had decided that stillness was the most powerful option available. He was aware of her the way you were aware of a mountain. Not threatening, just present. An undeniable fact of the landscape. Virgil's eyes found her. And something happened that Gideon noted and filed. Virgil's eyes moved to Kestrel, 6 feet of her, broad-shouldered, not moving, looking back at him with no expression and no flinch. And for a fraction of a moment, something shifted in his face. Not fear, not respect, exactly. The recalculation of a man who arrived expecting one kind of situation and found he was looking at a different kind. He looked away, looked back at Gideon. Debt's due in 2 weeks, Gideon's. It is. You'll have it in 2 weeks. Virgil nodded pleasantly. as if this was exactly what he'd expected, and he was entirely satisfied. He looked at the farm, the barn, the fields. "Place looks well," he said. "Better than when Silas was here." A glance toward Kestrel. "Brief. Hard workers. We do what needs doing," Kestrel said. Flat. The voice of someone who was not going to give him anything more complex than that. Virgil smiled again. A man who has reminded someone of something and is satisfied with the reminder. "I'm sure you'll have it." He turned back toward his horse. "Oh," he said, turning back. "The performance of a man who has just remembered something. The canyon. Any gold you pull from that creek runs through the production rights agreement. Same as the cattle, same as the wheat. Every ounce." He knew about the gold, of course he knew. He'd always known. Gideon kept his face still, kept his hands loose and away from the rifle. 12 rifles. 3 people on that porch he was not willing to lose. The calculation was simple. "Understood," said he. Virgil mounted, looked down. "Smart man," he said, and sounded genuinely faintly surprised by that. He rode out, his 12 men following, single file through the gate. They watched until the very quietly. He already knew. Yes, he knew before we started digging. Yes. Gideon looked at Kestrel. She was already looking at him. "Silas told him," she said, "before he left. They planned this together. He knew what we'd find, and he set the debt and the timeline, knowing we'd work it and still fall short." She watched the last of the dust settle. "He's known from the beginning. The farm was always going to him. The only question was when. The bottom fell out of the math they'd been building. If Virgil knew what they could realistically pull from that canyon in 4 weeks, and he did, then he'd set the terms knowing they'd fall short. The farm had never been in genuine danger of being paid off. It had always been going to Virgil Crane. The only was how much work he could get out of them first. Nora had come onto the porch while they were watching Virgil ride out. She read their faces with the precision that was her particular skill. "Tell me," she said. Gideon told her. She sat down on the porch steps, looked at her hands. Then up. "The originals," she said, her voice careful. "Building something. We still have the original documents." "Yes. And the loan document. In the house." She stood. "Come inside," she said. "I need to show you something." The documents spread across the kitchen table. The partnership agreement, the loan, the deed, the survey map. Every piece of paper they had. In lamplight, Nora moved through them with the focused attention of someone who had been through them before. Late at night, probably, looking for something she hadn't been able to name yet, she found the page, held it to the lamp. "Here," she said. The clause was small, buried, 3/4 through a paragraph about repayment. Gideon read it twice. "Any dispute regarding the terms of this agreement must be raised in writing to the lending party no later than 14 days prior to the payment date, through a licensed officer of the court." "A licensed officer of the court, a judge," Willa said. "Over his shoulder, or a lawyer," Nora said. "But out here, there's a circuit judge," Gideon said. He was thinking, remembering something from the Santa Fe saloon. Something Silas had mentioned in passing that he'd noted at the time, and then filed without knowing why. "Judge Amos Pell runs the circuit through this territory. Blackwater, Copperfield, Red Creek." He looked up. "He's due in Blackwater in 3 weeks. 1 week before the debt came due." Nora's eyes were bright. "If we get to Pell," she said, "raise the dispute formally. Force Virgil to answer for the production rights clause, the terms." "It doesn't cancel the debt," Gideon said. "No. But it might change what Virgil can do when we're short." She looked at him. "And if Pell is the kind of judge who pays attention," Kestrel said, from the far end of the table, looking at all the paper that had been used to build the trap they were standing in. "We need to find out if Pell pays attention," she said, "to things that don't look like fraud until you look carefully." Gideon thought about Virgil Crane, riding away satisfied. A man who'd been running this same scheme in territory after territory, and was still running it, which meant nobody had stopped him yet. which meant nobody had looked carefully yet, or nobody had been in position to. "I'll go to Blackwater," Gideon said. "Not yet," Nora said. "In 2 weeks, when Pell arrives. Go with everything. The documents, the numbers, the survey map. All of it." She stacked the papers neat, organized, the way she did everything. "In the meantime," she said, "we keep working. We keep pulling gold. We keep the cattle healthy and the crops watered, and we don't let Virgil Crane see us fold." She looked at each of them, because if we fold before the clock runs out, he wins early. And I am not interested in that. Willa picked up her coffee. "No," she said, "we're not." Kestrel looked at Gideon. He looked back at her. "2 more weeks," he said. "2 more weeks," she said back. Outside, the valley went golden, then amber, then the deep blue before dark. Beautiful and indifferent and completely unaware of what 4 people were deciding in a kitchen by lamplight, Gideon looked at the documents. At the names on the loan: Nora Finch, Willa Cade, Kestrel, written in Silas Rook's hand, signed without their knowledge to a debt designed to never be paid, and something settled in him. Cold and certain, not rage, rise. The kind that came from understanding exactly what needed to be done, and deciding to do it, not because success was guaranteed, but because the alternative was letting bad men win. And some things a man couldn't live with. He'd learned that in Virginia. He was learning it again here, in a kitchen, in the lamplight. Looking at a document that wore the face of law and functioned as a weapon. 2 more weeks, he said again, and meant every syllable. 10 days. That was what remained. When Gideon sat down at breakfast and looked at the number they had against the number they needed and did not say anything because everyone at that table had already done the same arithmetic, and speaking it out loud would not improve it. $4,800. Gold dust and coin. And the proceeds from 6 cattle Willa had managed to sell to a passing drover at close to fair price before Virgil's men could note it. 4,800 against 6,500. 1,700 short. The seam was giving less. Not nothing, but less, like something that had been generous and was starting to feel the cost. 200 more, maybe 250, if they pushed everything they had. 5,000 total. Optimistically, 1,500 short at best. And Virgil's production rights agreement meant every ounce of that gold had to be declared at Virgil's price, which meant 60 cents on the dollar, maybe less, which meant even the gold they'd bled for in that cold canyon might not count at full value. The math was getting worse, not better. Gideon looked at his coffee, at the table, at the 3 women eating breakfast with the efficiency of people who had stopped wasting energy on expressions that didn't serve a function. There has to be something. There always has to be something, and sometimes there isn't. Stop. What do you actually have? $5,000. 10 days. A buried clause in a loan document. And a circuit judge named Amos Pell, who was due in Blackwater in 3 days. 3 days. He set down his cup. "I'm riding to Blackwater today," he said. Everyone looked at him. "Pell's circuit. He'll be there by Thursday. I want to be there when he arrives. Before Virgil gets to him." Nora put down her fork. "That's 2 days' ride, day and a half if I push. Going to Blackwater doesn't fix the money." "No," he said. "But it might fix what happens when the money isn't enough." Silence. The thinking kind, not the giving up kind. Kestrel looked at him. "You think Pell will help?" "I think Pell might be the kind of man who pays attention," he said. "And I think we need to find out before we're out of time." She held his gaze. "Measuring something specific. Take the originals," she said. "Everything." "That was already the plan, I know." She picked up her fork. "I wanted to say it out loud." He left before the sun was fully up. Nora had packed food. Willa had checked his horse's shoes without being asked or mentioned. Kestrel was at the gate when he rode through. She didn't say anything, just looked at him the way she looked at things she needed to remember accurately. He looked back, rode. The ride to Blackwater was a day and a half of country that had no interest in his timeline. Beautiful country, brutal country. Red rock and sage and hawks riding thermals, so high they were just marks against the blue. No settlements, no other riders, just the road and the horse, and the weight of everything he carried in the saddlebag, and the heavier things he carried without a bag. He thought about Clara on the first day. Not the early grief, the tearing, suffocating kind. Something quieter now, more like a conversation with someone who wasn't there, but whose voice he could still reconstruct with some accuracy. She would have liked Kestrel. That thought arrived and surprised him with its specificity. Clara, who had no patience for people who talked instead of doing, who valued competence above almost every other quality, who had laughed, really laughed, the involuntary kind, at people who confused the performance of a thing with the thing itself. She would have looked at Kestrel and said something dry and exactly right, and meant it as the highest form of compliment she knew how to give. He sat with that for a while, then put it away and focused on the road. Blackwater, after 2 days of empty country, looked like everything. Judge Amos Pell was already in the hotel dining room. 70 or so, white hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, lean with decades of hard living and long distances. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent 30 years administering law in country that didn't much want it, and had arrived at very specific conclusions about human nature as a result. He looked up when Gideon sat down across from him without asking, assessed him in about 2 seconds with the efficiency of someone who'd been reading strangers. For 3 decades, you're not from this territory, Pell said. Recent arrival, what do you want? Direct. Good. Gideon was tired of people who weren't. I want to tell you about Virgil Crane, he said. Pell's expression didn't change, which was its own answer. Sit down, son, he said. Though Gideon was already sitting. And start from the beginning. He talked for 2 hours. Pell ate his dinner and his dessert and 2 cups of coffee and listened without interrupting, without the face people made when they were forming opinions before you'd finished talking. Just listened. Like listening was a skill he'd committed to. Gideon laid everything out. The deed, the partnership agreement, the loan and its terms, the production rights clause, the names on documents that had been signed without knowledge, the timeline, the arithmetic, the architecture of it. Kestrel's word, which kept being the right one. Then he put the original documents on the table. Pell read them, carefully. The way someone read who understood that the truth was usually in the detail, not the headline. It took a while. When he finished, he removed his spectacles and set them beside the documents and looked out the window at the Blackwater Street, Virgil Crane. He said, "Yes, I know that name." Gideon waited. "I know it," Pell said, "because I've heard it before. In 2 other territories, in 2 other situations that sounded like what you're describing." He looked at Gideon, pale eyes, clear. The quality of eyes that had processed a great deal without flinching. Different names on the loan documents, different women. Same production rights clause, same buried payment timing. Gideon's chest did something. "You already knew," he said. "I knew something," Pell said carefully. "I didn't have documents. I had the accounts of people who'd already lost what they had and couldn't show how. Testimony without paper." He looked at what was on the table. "These are documents. Original documents. Silas Rook left them. He was careless about that part. Or he assumed no one would know what to do with them." Pell studied the papers for another long moment. "This clause," he said, pointing to the payment timing. "The sunrise clause. The one nobody had mentioned until Virgil arrived to use it. Nora Finch found it," Gideon said. "She'd read those documents 12 times. That clause wasn't there in the first 10 readings." Pell looked at him over the rim of his spectacles. "You're saying it was inserted? The ink looks different. The pressure of the pen. Someone added it after the document was notarized." A pause. "We can't prove it under laboratory conditions. But it's visible." Pell looked for a long time. Then he closed the documents carefully, like they had value. "Which they did. I'll be there," he said. "When Crane comes home for payment." Something loosened in Gideon's chest. "I can't pay the full debt. We're short, I know. So even with you there, let me worry about what I can do when I'm there, Pell said. He picked up his spectacles and folded them. Put them in his breast pocket. You go back, get every dollar you can get. Have everyone present when Crane arrives. He looked at Gideon, all of them. I want to see who built that farm. He rode back faster than he'd ridden out. Not because he had good news. He wasn't sure yet what he had. But he'd been gone 2 days, and the canyon wasn't working itself. And 10 days had become 8 while he sat in a hotel dining room with an old judge. 8 days. He pushed the horse. He came through the gate at dusk on the second day. Kestrel was in the yard. She'd heard his horse on the road a quarter-mile out, probably knew his horse's particular gait by now, which was the kind of knowing that developed between people who lived and worked in close proximity. He dismounted. She looked at him. Reading. Pell will come, he said. Something moved in her face. What does that mean for us? I don't know exactly. He handed her the reins. Old reflex, offer the horse to whoever is closest. She took them without comment. It means we're not alone with it anymore. It means someone with authority knows what Virgil Crane has been doing. That's not $6,500. No, he's not. She looked at him. At the horse. Back at him. How short are we? 1,500. Maybe a little less. Quiet. The evening sounds of the farm. Crickets beginning. The cattle settled somewhere in the west pasture. Nora found something, she said. While you were gone, she looked at the house. Come inside. Nora had the documents reorganized, sorted by date. Certain passages marked with small pencil dots. The marks of someone building an argument. The production clause, she said when he sat. I've been reading it again. Every word, she pointed. It covers cattle. It covers crops. It covers, I'm quoting directly, all agricultural produce extracted from the property, including gold, Willa said. Arms crossed at the table, including gold, Nora agreed. But she moved to the survey map. Pointed to the northern canyon wall. The property line runs along the base of the canyon wall. Not up into the hillside, he looked at where she was pointing. At the survey line, at the seam in the rock face, they'd been working for 2 weeks, which was 60 feet back from the creek. Up in the hillside, above the property line, he looked at Nora. The hard rock gold, he said, isn't on the property, she said, strictly speaking. The creek gravel is. The alluvial deposits are. But the seam, she tapped the map. The seam is above the line, which meant Virgil's production rights didn't cover it, which meant every ounce they'd pulled from that rock face was theirs. Fully. At full market value. Without Virgil's percentage or Virgil's pricing, Gideon sat back, did the math again. With the actual numbers, we might be close, he said. We might be close, Nora confirmed. How close? She looked at the ledger, the real one. $200. Give or take. We're still 200 short, even with the seam gold at full market value. $200. 6,300 against 6,500. So close it almost made him laugh. Except it didn't, because $200 with 8 days left was still a different kind of impossible. Just a more precise one. A kind that felt worse because you could see exactly where you'd fallen short. Willa was looking at the table. I have a ring, she said. Willa. Nora started. Silver, my mother's, flat, without reaching for sympathy or offering it. Worth maybe $70, $80. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked up. I'm choosing to. There's a difference. She looked at Gideon. What else? He knew the answer before he finished, asking himself the question. The rifle, custom built. A craftsman in Cheyenne in 1870 who had made exactly 40 of them. Gideon had bought it the year after the war because he'd carried an Army-issue Springfield for 4 years and he'd wanted something that was his. Something chosen, not assigned. He'd carried it through Wyoming and Colorado and 3 days of riding to arrive here. He looked at Kestrel. She was already looking at him, already knew. Because she read him the way she read land. Don't, she said. It'll bring 150. Maybe more. It's yours. So is this farm, he said. So is this debt. So is the decision. He held her gaze. So are all of you. A long moment. She looked away first. The only time in the entire 4 weeks he'd seen her do that. Nora, she said. Without looking up, Nora was already adding, 70 for the ring, 150 for the rifle. That's 220. She looked up. That's enough, barely. With nothing left over, nothing for error or contingency, but enough. He rode to Blackwater the next morning and sold the rifle to the gunsmith. The man tried to pay 110. Gideon looked at him with the eyes of a man who had nothing left to sell and wasn't going to pretend he had leverage he didn't. The gunsmith paid 130, which, combined with Willa's ring sold to a jewelry merchant, was enough. On his way out of town, he walked into the hotel. Pell was in the dining room. Same table, different meal, same window. He looked up when Gideon sat down. "You're back. We found a legal argument about the production rights clause. I want to walk you through it before you come out." Pell poured him coffee from the pot on the table. "Talk," he said. He laid out the survey line argument. The seam running above the property boundary. Virgil's own surveyor, who had mapped the canyon wall, and therefore mapped the line that excluded the seam from Virgil's production rights. Pell listened, looked at the survey notes Gideon had brought. Looked at them carefully. "The surveyor's name is on these," he said. "Still in Blackwater," Gideon said. Pell folded the papers. Put them in his coat. "I'll be at your farm in 6 days," he said. "Have everything ready." He was back at the farm by the next evening. $6,340 in a leather satchel. Every cent they had. Nothing left. He put it on the kitchen table. 4 people looked at it. "The seam gold at full value," Nora said. Not a question. Yes, Pell agrees the property line argument is solid. He says, "It gives us grounds to dispute the production rights application to the seam gold after the fact, which means Virgil can't legally adjust our payout on the hard rock gold." He looked at her. "Which means we get full value on all of it." Willa looked at the satchel, "And we're still short. We're still short. By how much? $160. Silence. "The heavy kind. Pell is coming," Gideon said. "Day after tomorrow. When Virgil arrives, a judge with documents doesn't fill a $160 gap," Kestrel said. "No," he looked at her. "But it changes what Virgil can do with the gap." She held his gaze. He could see her thinking. Not out loud, not with her face, but with a stillness that somehow communicated the complexity happening behind it. "He'll still try take the farm," she said, "probably. So we're in the same place, different place," he said. "Worse in one way, better in several." She kept looking at him. "Worse because we're short," he said. "Better because Pell has documents now. Because Pell has seen those documents and knows what they prove. Because Virgil is going to walk into a situation he believes he controls and find out he doesn't." A long moment. "You're betting on a 70-year-old judge," she said. "I'm betting on evidence and a man who pays attention to it." He paused. "And I'm betting on us. On what we built here. On the fact that a man who runs this scheme in territory after territory eventually runs it in front of someone who's been waiting for him." Nora looked at the lamp. "That's what Pell said, isn't it?" she said. "That he'd been waiting." "He said he'd known the name for a while," Gideon said. "He'd been waiting for documents, and now he has them. Now he has them. The fire in the stove. The lamp on the table. Outside, the valley dark and quiet and indifferent to what was being decided inside it." Willa reached into her pocket. Put her silver ring on the table. Nora reached into hers. Put down a small brooch. Carved bone. Old. "My grandmother's," she said. "I don't know what it's worth. But it's something." They looked at Kestrel. She looked at the table. At the ring and the brooch and the satchel. And 4 weeks of blood and cold and broken skin and everything poured into this piece of ground. She reached under the collar of her shirt, pulled out a cord. At the end of it, a bracelet. Copper. Heavy. Chiricahua work that meant something specific that he didn't know how to read but understood had weight. Her mother's, He knew that much. She'd said she'd never take it off. She looked at him. And her face, not broken. Kestrel did not break, but showing him the one underneath the composed one. The real one. The one that cost something to let someone see. Don't, he said. You sold your rifle. That's different. How? He didn't have an answer. Because it wasn't different. It was exactly the same. Both of them handing over the last thing they had. He looked at the table, at everything on it, at 4 weeks of impossible. We're not done yet, he said. Everyone looked at him. 2 more days, he said. The sea might give more. The creek might give more. 2 more days of everything we have. Willa was already standing. Dawn, she said. Dawn. Kestrel put the bracelet back around her wrist, tucked it back under her collar where it lived. She caught him watching. Still not done, she said. Still not done, he said back. 2 days, 2 of the hardest days they'd worked. All 4 at the canyon, in the mornings. Farm work in the afternoons. Nobody sleeping more than 4 hours either night. The seam gave another $80. The creek gave $30. Willa found color in a section of the bend they hadn't touched. A small pocket that yielded $40 in half a day. 150 additional, $6,490. $10 short, $10. Gideon stood at the table on the evening before Virgil Crane was due and looked at that number and thought, $10. We came $10 short of all of this. Which was when he turned his pockets out. Old habit, 5 years of knowing exactly what he had. $3.72 on the table. Nora turned hers out. $1.15. Willa. $2.08. They all looked at Kestrel. She reached into her shirt pocket, drew out a small piece of folded paper, unfolded it. $6.40. They all looked at the pile on the table. Nora counted. $13.35. Against a shortfall of 10, nobody spoke. Then Willa said, "We have $3.35 to spare." And then they laughed, all 4 of them. Around the kitchen table at 10 at night with tomorrow still ahead of them. And $3.35 to spare after 4 weeks of the hardest work any of them had ever done. It wasn't funny. There was nothing funny about it. And they laughed anyway. The way people laughed when the alternative was something they couldn't afford, the involuntary kind. The kind you couldn't have planned or controlled. Gideon laughed until his ribs hurt, until the sound of it surprised him, until he realized he hadn't laughed like that, real and out of control and slightly ridiculous since before Clara died. That made him want to stop. Then it didn't, because she would have laughed too. Clara would have laughed first and hardest. He let himself have that, just for a moment. Let it be funny and true and both of those things at once. They went to sleep. Tomorrow came. Virgil Crane arrived at noon. Same 12 men. Same expensive horse. Same practiced ease of a man arriving somewhere he'd already decided was his. Except this time there was a second horse tied outside the house. Old. Patient. The horse of a man who had been covering long distances for a long time and had made peace with it. Virgil saw it. His eyes moved to it briefly. And something in his expression did the calculation that his eyes always did when he arrived somewhere expecting one situation and found another. Not fear, calculation. He dismounted, walked to the porch where the 4 of them stood, and just inside the doorway, standing with the unhurried posture of a man who had nowhere else to be and no particular reason to hurry, was Judge Amos Pell. Wire-rimmed spectacles, white hair, lean and still. Virgil stopped. "Judge," he said. "Virgil," Pell said, mild. Entirely mild. The mildness of a man with no need for display. "Don't recall you being invited out this way." "No," Pell agreed. "You didn't invite me." A pause. Virgil looked at Gideon, at all 4 of them, at the horse tied outside, at Pell in the doorway. "Running numbers, got my money," he said. Gideon stepped down off the porch, extended the satchel. Virgil took it. Handed it to one of his men without looking. The man opened it, began to count. Nobody spoke while that happened. The valley, the mountains, The creek somewhere out of sight, always running, the counting finished. The man looked at Virgil, leaned in, spoke quietly. Virgil looked at Gideon. 6,500, yes, in full, in full. Virgil was quiet for a moment, something behind his eyes. A calculation that wasn't coming out the way he'd expected. There's still the matter of the production rights, he said. The gold from that canyon. Under our agreement, the seam gold isn't covered, Pell said, quiet, from the doorway. The production rights clause covers resources extracted from the property. The seam runs above the survey line. Your surveyor mapped that wall, Virgil. He mapped the line. Virgil looked at Pell. Whose surveyor? Yours, Pell said. The same man who surveyed this property before you had Silas Rook put it on the market. He took off his spectacles, polished them, put them back. I've been thorough these past several days. The 12 men behind Virgil went very still. The particular stillness of men who were quietly reassessing which side was the safe one to be standing on. Virgil looked at the satchel, at Pell, at Gideon, at the porch where Kestrel stood, nearly 6 feet of her, broad-shouldered, not moving, looking back at him, without flinching and without hatred and without anything, except the clear, steady attention of someone who had decided exactly what she was looking at. He looked at her for a long time. Then something in Virgil Crane's face changed, not dramatically, not with any theater. Just shifted, the way light shifted when something passed over the sun. The performance dropped away. Not all of it, but enough. He looked older, tired in a way he hadn't looked when he'd ridden in. 6,500, he said to himself, testing the words, trying to understand why they felt different than he'd expected them to feel. He looked at Pell. You have documents, I have yours, Pell said, and the originals, and sworn statements from 2 families in 2 other territories. A pause. I have enough, Virgil. Virgil was quiet for a long moment. His 12 men still quiet, my wife, he said, abrupt, like words that had been waiting behind a door and got through, before he could stop them. You know about her. I know she died, Pell said. 1868. He looked at the mountains, at the 3 sides of the valley that didn't care about this conversation. Clara, fever. Same winter took half the territory, flat, without performance, just saying what was true. My 3 daughters, too, all of them. In 1 week, the yard was very quiet. After that, he stopped, started again. After that, I stopped caring what happened to anything, to anyone, because nothing held, nothing you built or loved held. It just, he made a small gesture, tired, gone. Nobody spoke. So I started taking, he said, because taking was easier than building, and because I was angry. He looked at the satchel in his man's hands. I stayed angry for a long time. He looked at Gideon. You lost someone, he said. Not 1881. Virgil nodded, like he'd suspected. And you're still here, still building. Trying to. Virgil looked at the farm, the barn, the fields, the channels running from the creek through the carefully fitted stone, the home that had been built by people who intended to stay in it. He looked at Kestrel last. She looked back, without flinching, without mercy, but without hatred either, just clear. The way the canyon water went clear after the storm had passed through. What's your name? Virgil said. Not asking her to justify anything. Just asking Kestrel, she said. He nodded. Your mother's people. Chiricahua. She said. He was quiet for a moment. My wife's neighbor, when we lived in Missouri, was Choctaw. Good woman. He looked at the ground. Best neighbor we ever had. A pause. I don't know why I said that, because it's true, Kestrel said. And you're tired of saying things that aren't. Something in his face. Not broken. But at the edge of it, yeah, he said. I think that's right. He looked at Pell. The debt is paid, I know, Pell said. Production rights agreement. He stopped. Looked at the satchel again. It's dissolved. He looked at his man. Give it back. His men stared at him. Give it back, Virgil said. The satchel. Put it on the porch. The man put it on the porch. Virgil looked at Pell. I'll come to Blackwater. Next week. I'll talk to you about the other families. Pell looked at him for a long moment. I'll be there, he said. Virgil turned to his horse, mounted. Didn't look back. His 12 men followed, uncertain, quiet. But following, they rode through the gate, and the dust rose behind them, and the valley absorbed the sound of them, and then they were gone. Gideon stood in the yard and listened to what came after. The creek, the wind, the cattle somewhere in the west pasture, the farm going on being a farm, regardless of what had just happened in its yard. Willa came off the porch, picked up the held it for a moment. Huh, she said. That was all. Just, huh, the single accurate possible response to the last 4 weeks. Nora sat down on the porch steps, quietly, like her legs had decided they were done for the moment. She didn't say anything. Just sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. Gideon looked at Kestrel. She was looking at the gate, at where the dust was still faintly visible. He'll answer for the others, she said. Pell will make sure. Gideon said, that's not the same as fixing what he did to them. No, he said. It's not. She was quiet, then. But it's something. It's something, he agreed. She turned, looked at him. The way she'd looked at him from the ridge on the first day, that complete focused attention, but different now. Not reading a stranger, reading someone she knew. You sold your rifle, she said. You almost gave me your bracelet, he said. A pause. Almost, she said. Almost, he agreed, and then something crossed her face. That shape that came before a smile. That shape he'd been watching for 4 weeks, the one that formed and almost became and then stopped short. This time it became small, restrained, real. It changed her whole face. Not by making it softer, because Kestrel's face was never going to be soft, and that was exactly right. But by making it warmer. Like a lamp turned up just slightly in a room that had been adequate before, and was something more now. He felt the locked room crack open, not all the way, but enough. Enough for something to come through. That wasn't grief, and wasn't fear, and wasn't the habit of keeping everyone at the distance that had felt like safety. That evening, after Nora had both ledgers and closed them with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose numbers had finally agreed with each other. After Willa had sharpened her knife one final time and declared it prepared for whatever came next. After the animals were settled and the fire banked, and the farm was doing what farms did when the day was finished. Gideon walked out to the apple tree, old tree. Had been here before Silas and before the 3 women, and would be here long after all of them. The oldest thing on the property, he took out his wallet. From inside, folded and worn soft from years of being carried. A photograph. Clara, 1878. The handwriting on the back had faded, but he'd read it enough times that the fading didn't matter. He looked at her for a long time, thought about what she would say. About this farm and these women, and the man he'd become across 4 weeks of cold water and hard work, and people who chose to stay. He thought she'd say, good, you stayed. That's the thing I always wanted for you, the staying kind. He thought she'd probably also say something about Kestrel that was dry and exactly right and meant as the highest compliment she knew how to give. He put the photograph back. Kestrel was behind him. She'd come out quietly. She was good at presence without announcement, at being there when that was what was needed, without requiring the moment to be named. He didn't turn around. I'm not done missing her, he said. I know, she said. That doesn't go away. No, she said. It doesn't. He turned. She was standing a few feet back. Close enough that the space between them wasn't empty. Far enough that he had what he needed. I don't have a name for what this is, he said. Meaning them. Meaning what had been building across 4 weeks of everything they'd been through together. I don't have a name for it yet. You don't need one, she said. Kestrel. Names are for things that are finished, she said. This isn't finished. He looked at her. At the woman who had stood in a yard and waited for him to ride down because she'd calculated that he would. Who had brought him coffee in the dark and sat in his chair and told him things that cost something to say, who had jumped into a mountain creek without hesitation and pulled him out and never mentioned it again, who had nearly given him the last thing she had, No, he said. It isn't. She looked at him with those dark eyes. At what was in his face that he'd stopped trying to hide. The farm needs a new fence line on the east side, she said. The wheat will be ready in 3 weeks. The cattle need rotating to the north pasture. A pause. There's enough work here for a long time, I know, he said. And you're staying. Not a question. But she waited for the answer anyway. Because some things needed to be said out loud, even when they were already known. I'm staying, he said. She nodded. The decisive nod of a woman who had received the information she needed and was already thinking about what came next. She walked back toward the house. At the door, she stopped. Turned back. Coffee's ready at 5, she said. Don't be late. And she went inside. Gideon stood under the apple tree in the dark valley, with the mountains on 3 sides, and the creek running thick somewhere he couldn't see, and the stars coming in one at a time, bright and cold and considerably less indifferent than they looked. He thought about what staying meant. Not the idea of it, the actual practice. Being somewhere every morning, building things that took longer than a season. Being known by people who saw you when you were exhausted and uncertain and still getting it wrong. And who stayed. Anyway, he thought about the locked room, about everything that lived in it, about grief and war and the things you carried that you couldn't put down. You didn't put them down, he understood that now. You'd just found people worth carrying them around. He looked at the old apple tree for a moment. Then he went inside 5 years later. Summer of 1892, the valley had changed in the way. Valleys changed when people worked them right for long enough, deeper into itself, more settled. The kind of fullness that came from seasons of intention. The farmhouse had 2 new rooms, a covered porch along the south side that caught the afternoon shade, a workshop where Nora kept her accounts, and where Willa, in a development that had surprised everyone, including herself, had taken up woodworking. With the same focused intensity she brought to everything. Gideon sat on that porch in the late afternoon watching. His son Colt was 8 years old. Black hair like his mother's, eyes the particular gray of his father's, looking out from his face with an expression that was already recognizably Kestrel's, measuring, unhurried, seeing more than he said. Nora was at the table under the oak tree with the boy working on his numbers. He was tolerating it with the patience of someone who knew that compliance now meant freedom later. Willa was in the corral. Colt had been angling to get over there for 20 minutes and was almost done earning it. Kestrel came around the corner of the barn, tall and unhurried and exactly herself. She'd been checking the irrigation channels. She checked them every week, the way she'd built them, with the attention of someone who understood that care was how things lasted. She came up onto the porch, stood beside him, looked at Colt at the table. He counted backward from 100 this morning, she said. I know. He told me twice. He was pleased with himself. He should be. Gideon looked at his son, the dark hair, the gray eyes, the face that belonged to 2 worlds, and was therefore making its own. He's got your head for numbers. He has your stubbornness. That's yours too, she looked at him. That look, the one he'd been receiving for 5 years, and still hadn't entirely decoded. The one that held more than she said, which was already more than most people said. Judge Pell is coming through next month, she said. Wants to make the seam boundary official in the county records. Good. Virgil's organization in Blackwater donated to the school fund last month, she said. Second time this year, Pell mentioned that. You think it means something? He thought about a man on a horse looking at a farm he'd expected to take and finding instead something he hadn't planned for. A man who'd lost everything and chosen cruelty as his response and who had been offered, in the end, one chance to choose differently. I think it means he's trying, Gideon said. Trying isn't finished. No, he said. But it's where finished starts. She was quiet, looking at the valley, the mountains on 3 sides, the creek catching the late afternoon light the way it always caught it, silver and alive. I used to wonder, she said, whether it would ever feel like enough, whether we'd get to the place we were trying to get to. Does it? He asked. She looked at him. No, she said. It feels like the beginning of something, a pause, which I think might be the same thing. Colt had gotten away from Nora, was running across the yacht toward corral with the specific, unconstrained motion of a child who had finished what he owed the day and understood he'd earned the rest of it. Willa saw him coming, held up one hand, not stopping him, telling him, slow down, approach careful, pay attention to the horse. He slowed. Because Colt always listened to Willa, had always listened to Willa, since the first time she'd handed him a brush at 2 years old, and said, brush, and he'd brushed, and the horse had leaned into it, and he'd looked up at her with enormous gray eyes. Willa showed him something. He watched, tried it. The horse responded. He tried again. From the porch, Gideon could see him grinning. The grin of a child learning something real, something that would still be true in 30 years. Kestrel's hand found his on the porch railing. Not a declaration. Not a gesture toward anything. Just her hand finding his the way it had learned to find it over 5 years of mornings, evenings, and everything. In between, he turned his hand over, held it below them. The valley went on being what it was. Green in the early evening light. Mountains solid on 3 sides. The creek running in the way it had been running before any of them arrived and would run long after. They built this. Not from nothing. From wreckage. From the ruins of other people's plans and their own grief and 4 weeks of cold water and broken hands and the specific, stubborn refusal to let bad men win. From choice. Made every day. That was what Colt would understand when he was old enough. That families weren't built from blood or law or contracts notarized in saloons. They were built from people who showed up in the morning, who stayed when leaving was possible, who said, without drama and without ceremony, this is the place, and these are the people, and I am not done yet, never quite done. Which was, he understood now, exactly as it should be. That was the whole point.